Welcome back to another 2023 team preview edition of the Slipstream podcast. Tonight we continue our series of dropping a new episode each and every day, counting down the constructors from 10th to 1st to get you prepped for the 2023 Formula One season. As always, we have the full crew porpoising in the Slipstream tonight with Matt, Austin, Cole Trickle Jr., and me, Brady. So for this episode, we'll be diving into Team Mercedes, who saw their 8-year run of winning Constructors' Championships come to a crashing end in 2022, finishing what many people thought was a shocking third place in 2022. So Matt, what the hell happened in 2022, and how surprised were you that they finished third?
Pretty surprised on the third place. Red Bull, made a strong case in 2021 to kind of be the favorite going into 2022, and Max, coming off his first championship, that made sense. Them falling below Ferrari, mainly due to a first 8 race poor stretch, really hindered them. So I'd say if you're asking me on a scale of 1 to 10 surprise, I'd probably say about a 7.5. It was kind of baffling that Ferrari was struggling so much and they took them over. And Ferrari still struggled last year and they still couldn't get past them.
Yeah, I think back to about this time last year when they had preseason testing and then the first weekend in Bahrain. They had their whole no side pod, version of this new generation of car come out. And I know this group, a lot of us were thinking like Mercedes just sandbagging. They'll be fine. It's no big deal. It's Mercedes, right? They'd won 8 straight Constructors' Championships. So, Cole, it turns out they weren't sandbagging, right?
Yeah, no, apparently not. I mean, like Matt said, I don't think we really believed it until halfway through the season. And even then, I thought for sure they would catch Ferrari and pass Ferrari. Yeah, I mean, very unlike Mercedes. I fully expect them to come back in full force this season. But yeah, very uncharacteristic of them. And especially Lewis just did not look on point for the first 3/4 of the season almost. I mean, for sure the first half. But yeah, they definitely had some growing pains with the porpoising. But yeah, did not see third place coming. I do not expect that again from them.
Yeah, so Sten, I thought, what was interesting early on in the season, I mean, we heard the word porpoising, I think 1,000 times over a race weekend, right? And clearly, I think all teams had some issue with it, some less than others, like Red Bull. Mercedes seemed to be had the biggest problem with it. And, we all assumed, or at least I assumed, that it's Mercedes, right? They're going to figure it out within a week or two, but they didn't. And ultimately, the FIA and Formula One had to come out with some floor change regulations to help limit the bouncing. And a lot of people thought that it was actually going to help Mercedes, but I think it had the inverse effect, right? Didn't it actually help Red Bull more than help Mercedes?
Yeah, I think Red Bull just had it figured out a little bit better. It was something about the anchor points, the rigidity of the floor, how much it could or couldn't move, its ride height, whichever. So, yeah, surprisingly, it did not come out right before Spa, and that was like the race that kind of like set the rest of the year on fire. Yeah, it's wild that Merck, while they still finished third, they definitely didn't look like they started very strong. But then, I'm trying to like remind myself of what all happened. Like the first 6 races, they hauled 25 plus points. So it's not like they weren't doing great. They just weren't dominant like they had been for the first time in an entire new era.
Right. I mean, there was a lot of issues earlier in the season, but there was glimmers of hope, I feel like, throughout the season that ultimately didn't really come to fruition until really maybe late in the season. What was it, Spain, when everyone thought that if Lewis had a different strategy, he probably could have won the race, that he at least had the pace to win the race. At least that was the theory, right? And so you kind of felt like, all right, I don't know, with Spain, maybe the 6th or 7th race, you're like, okay, Mercedes has finally figured it out. And now they're going to play catch up a little bit. They've got arguably the best driver lineup of anyone with Lewis and George. Some may debate that, but everyone was excited for George to get that opportunity in the Mercedes after 3 years at Williams, but it just never happened. So Matt, are they going to make it up in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they can get to first, but I think they're an easy second in 2023. Not I think they have if you want to say, but they have the best combo driver pairing. It's hard to go against Red Bull. It's just how good Max has been. If you're going to go from an equal standpoint of whatnot. But I do think that George and Lewis will finish 2-3 in the constructors next year. That would be my prediction, and that'll kind of help them. But I do think that they're maybe not back on an 8-run constructor championship level back, but I think they are well better than what they were last year.
And Matt, just sticking with you real quick, because I know you shared some of these numbers back when we were doing, podcasts after the races. How would you rate George's first season in the Mercedes? I mean, he obviously finished ahead of Lewis. He was P4 in the Drivers' Championship. Lewis was P7. So he did pretty well, given, that Mercedes, based on their expectations, weren't as good as everyone thought they'd be.
I mean, I think George came in and from being in a bad car for Mercedes, but a great car for George, he showed out. I mean, he showed really well. I mean, he had a strong first year in the upper tier constructor. He got his first win in Brazil. He was the most, outside of Max, the most consistent driver on the track. I think out of 22 races, 19 he finished in the top 5, which is pretty incredible.
So I think what Matt was saying, something really interesting is George finished in the top 5 until Great Britain, and then he had his DNF, lap 1, turn 1. I think we all remember that now. And then outside of that, he had a 14th in Singapore, which he had contact early, ended up pitting, went on the dry tires to see if he could kind of salvage his race. It never came to fruition. And his only other finish that was outside of the top 5 was in Japan. Again, rain race, delayed race, kind of a whole bunch of stuff going on. But George had a phenomenal first year. And if he would have had the car behind him that they had in years past, would have probably been closer than the Bottas gap to Lewis, which was really impressive.
Yeah, I agree. And Cole, I'm curious of your thoughts. I mean, do you think that if Mercedes gets it right this year, that it's a 3-way battle for the championship? I mean, you could add Ferrari in this, and we'll talk about Ferrari on our next podcast. But could you see a scenario where it's Max, Lewis, George fighting for the title, or do you think it would be more of a Lewis, Max, rematch?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, today when we're recording, Mercedes launched their new black on black livery. It's also George Russell's birthday, so normally I pull for whoever the underdog is, and I'm going to say this season, given how dominant Red Bull has been, I'm going to say it's Merck's time to shine again. They're back. It's happening. Black on black takes the championship. Hopefully it's Lewis. Could be George. I mean, y'all both talked about it earlier. I mean, George got a win last year, and it's Lewis's first season without one. So I do think that there is grounds for George to be in the championship conversation. I don't know if that's actually going to happen. I do see Lewis winning the championship, and I do see Mercedes winning the constructors in a close battle with Ferrari, not with Red Bull. But that's my prediction for the season: is it is Mercedes and Ferrari battling it out the last few races.
Brady, you made an interesting comment earlier about how Lewis could have theoretically won Spain. I don't know if you remember, but didn't he get a puncture or some issue in lap 1 and ended up pitting? And at some point early had recommended to, I think it was James Allison maybe, or even it was just Bono, like, let's just retire the car. Why are we putting this mileage on this engine? There's no chance. And that was like, well, you've always... You remember 2022, like the porpoising, you remember him talking about how his back was nearly broken in Baku. Like there were physical limitations and challenges in that season, but that seemed like one of the first times that you saw that kind of like mental fracture where he was just willing to like not finish the race and just save components. So it definitely started way differently than the way that the season panned out in the end.
Right. I mean, I think it was fascinating that, if you go back to the end of 2021, and we're not going to rehash Abu Dhabi, but we know those events, right? And the Drive to Survive comes out before the season starts in 2022. And wasn't it the very last scene of the whole series was Toto saying something like, "You better watch out"? He made some prediction comment about, we're coming. And they didn't, right? I mean, I know we had conversations going into summer break last year, like, all right, we definitely see Mercedes coming back and fighting for second and passing Ferrari. We think, Lewis will end up finishing P2 or P3, and it just never happened. Um, if we had gone back 1 year from right now and someone told you Lewis isn't going to get a pole or a win in 2022, you would have thought we were all full of crap. No one would have thought that that's what was going to happen. So yeah, Austin, I think that's, fascinating just in the world of sports. And Matt, I don't know if you have any opinions on this, but when you're constantly at the mountaintop, like Mercedes has been, and specifically Lewis, I mean, 7 championships, and then all of a sudden you're fighting for 5th and 6th, you want to see that competitive spirit. And I definitely think he started to get that towards the end of the season, but there was definitely a time where you're like, all right, when he's not in front, and we heard what Alonso said in Spa, that he doesn't know how to drive unless he's in the front. So do you think that actually happened to Lewis? Do you think we saw some sort of cracks in his armor, at least for a few weeks last year?
I think it did take him some time to get used to the car. Right, it's probably the worst car he's been in 7 years. I mean, 7, 8 years. It's been a change for him. I mean, I will give some numbers for how well I do think that he did, especially towards the end of the season. And this is just comparisons with him and George. So the last 15 races of the season, Lewis outscored George in the championship points. Lewis had more podiums than George, 9-8. Lewis had more top 2 finishes than George, 5-2. And Lewis actually had a 12 race stint, kind of there in the middle of the season, where he outscored George by 24 points. So towards that end of the season, if you take out those first 7 races where Lewis struggled mightily, he outperformed his teammate for almost 2/3 of the season. Not saying that that'll happen again. George is getting better. His experience is getting there. Lewis's age isn't slowing down. But I think Lewis, once he got his feet underneath him, he got a lot out of the car more than we think he did, because we were just expecting him to win, 15 races in a year, 12 races in a year.
Right. And Cole, there was definitely a time, I mean, late in the season, I think Lewis came out and said that he basically was the guinea pig. He told the team, put anything and everything on my car to try to figure it out. And so, that sacrifice, I don't remember what he said, but he said sacrificed, half of his season just to help them figure out how to get it right. And I don't know if we should believe that or not, but, as a champion, you're our reigning fantasy champion, right? Everyone has to find motivation. And sometimes failure or not living up to expectations can remotivate somebody, right? We know there were rumors about Lewis retiring, or how much longer does he have in the sport. And maybe a down season like 2022 is actually what he needed to be remotivated, to prove to everyone that he's Max's, superior and win another
championship. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think he's going to come back motivated, hungry, and Angela Cullen is going to be ready for those massages. I think he's coming back with a vengeance this season. I really do. I think he had some time last season to kind of figure it out and to figure out the porpoising. And I've not been a Lewis fan for years. I'm always for the underdog, and I think it's time for Mercedes again. I think it was just so painful for them last season. I can't imagine being Toto, right, and going from winning that many titles to having that car on the track and just praying that you can get some points or that you can figure out what's wrong with the car. So yeah, I'm excited. I do expect big things from Lewis and George this season.
And part of it, if you just look at 2022, I mean, Mercedes is a well-oiled machine. You don't win 8 straight championships by accident, right? So they didn't have very many failures, right? I don't know if they had the least amount of failures and DNFs last year, other than a couple of crashes. But Stan, I'm curious, and I don't know if you know all the technical aspects of this, but one of the most unique things about their car last year and now this year with the livery reveal is the nose side pods, and they seem to be sticking with it for this season. Although Toto did come out today during the livery reveal and said that there will be a change at some point early in the season. So I don't know if that means they're going to add side pods or not, but what do you make of it? They were certainly the only one that took that direction.
Yeah, I think, during the livery reveals, you're always seeing like a Franken car. You're seeing different parts from different components and years and whatever just to throw something together. They're not going to show their hand and let someone get an extra 2-3 weeks of data analysis by running, CAD sim work on the vehicles. So, well, yes, the car is probably still no side pod. They made that shift. It's something that they invested in, and they said that they think that it's right, and they're going to put all their eggs in one basket. Going back to the Lewis thing, I think it was a noble response for him to say, just throw all have my car for testing. But I also think I hope that something works really well to make me get out of my season slump. But whatever, it doesn't matter. But yeah, I mean, think about the difference between Spain and Bahrain preseason testing last year. Red Bull went from a bigger, bulkier side pod to something that was more sleek, and it kind of made everyone like their eyebrows raise. I remember there was a shot of Adrian Newey kind of just smiling and like, yep, this is going to happen. So the constructors have the ability to change things, and it's likely that they're parallel pathing similar paths. But it was interesting that they took such a broad approach early. Only time will tell to see if it pans out for them. I would assume that they have enough experience and people and just knowledge that it'll probably pan out for them. But again, I not as being an anti-Lewis fan or anti-Mercedes, but it's good to have other teams winning. And I don't know if I'm ready to let them fall back into the form that they were in for nearly a full decade.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I don't know if I want to go back to the Mercedes just full on, 1-2 every weekend before Max sort of arrived on the scene and sort of interrupted that, right? One of my favorite things about the new regulations from last year was just that there was so much variance in how they interpreted it, and almost every constructor had a different interpretation. It looks different. And we probably talked about this a little bit on last year's podcast, is that you kind of get the feeling that over time, as these regulations mature, that everyone will kind of move towards a similar direction, right? It's proven that that's the direction, that's the fastest car, et cetera, et cetera. But with all these livery reveals, it doesn't seem like that. It's still, Ferrari's got their side pods, Red Bull has theirs, Aston Martin looks like they've got a lot of new updates for 2023. Mercedes is sticking to their guns. So, Matt, I don't know if you like that approach, or if you eventually think by the end of 2024, they'll all kind of look the same, but I like it.
I think it's cool that we have all these cars that just look different outside that they're all becoming black. But at some point, you're not going to stick to your guns if it's not helping you. So eventually, if there's enough testing where whatever it's side pods or wings or no, whatever it may be, eventually they're all going to start to just morph into kind of how they have all before. They'll look the same. It may not be this year, may not be next year, but we'll get there. I wish it wouldn't, but it'll end up being there.
I guess what makes that most challenging is the cost cap, right? I mean, they can't just flip the car upside down and redo it, because otherwise they'd spend all their money. And we know what happens when you go over the cost cap. We'll talk about
you
that.
You get your wrist slapped.
I mean, this isn't Mercedes related, but Cole, I know you'll appreciate this. A part of me has a feeling that Lawrence Stroll's just going to say screw it and just spend $700 billion to try to build a winning race car. There's rumors that there's already teams over, or there were 6 teams over last year. So, who knows? But, they all talk about it, and they talk about, Matt, you brought this up with the livery reveals. There's a lot more black elements in the cars, and a lot of that's just because it's bare, naked carbon fiber. They're saving weight by not actually painting it, and it saves like 6 kilograms of paint, which obviously matters. So I don't know what to make of it. I think the car looks great. I know, Cole, you do too, and you got your Patronus shades on to back it up.
Yeah, I'm going to come back real fast about Lawrence Stroll. I know we're not talking about Aston Martin right now, but there is rumor that Christian Horner is saying he's hearing big numbers out of Aston Martin for this season. So, yeah, I can't wait to see what Aston Martin does. But yeah, back to the liveries. I do like all the black that we're getting to on all the cars, but stripping it down to save a tiny bit of weight. I mean, I'm not a big fan of that. I'm good with the Mercedes all black, right? I think that it flows, it looks beautiful, but I think all the other cars who've just kind of copied and pasted their livery from last year, who are just stripping off little bits of paint, I'm not a big fan of that. But I also agree. I think the cars will look very, very similar by 25. I think everyone will just copy each other to the best of their ability.
One thing on the paint and the weight. So Martin had said, he always says it, but do you guys know how much 1 kilogram of weight is over a race?
No,
like
fire
time?
Yeah, time.
It's like 0.13 seconds or something like that. Or maybe
so it's like 0.1 to 0.1 to 0.15, whatever it would be. So like over let's look at Austria, which is 70 plus laps. That's 7 seconds.
In paint.
Like that's if it's a kilogram of weight, 1 kilogram over an entire Austria race distance is 7 seconds. That's big.
It is like, well, Mercedes and Toto talked about how they were overweight last year, which is crazy considering they were like the only car without hips. Usually that's where the fat is, right? And they didn't have that, and they were still overweight.
And we talked about this when we previewed Alfa Romeo. That's why Alfa Romeo was so good early, because they nailed the weight limit. And then every other car found different ways to trim. So again, I think it's smart to do what you can now. But I think that in the next probably 2 years or so, you'll start seeing teams adding ballast in that they've reached and gotten below the weight limits. And now they're strategically adding ballast or extra weight in smart places to make the car handle differently based on what its characteristics are. But it's probably not a this year thing yet.
They're just adding like 17 coats of paint to get up to the weight
to distribute it evenly.
Yeah.
Add some more of those like neon signage things, like what McLaren had last year. Add a little extra weight. So yeah, I mean, so let's talk. Wrap up with 2023. I know, Cole. Unless you want to add anything to your predictions, you're all in on Mercedes bouncing back this year. Yeah.
Again, not a Mercedes fan. I'm Mercedes this year, though. That car, I'm 100% all in on Mercedes this season.
Matt, what about you? Do they bounce back and win the constructors, or do they improve but maybe not win it over Red Bull? What do you think?
I don't think they win. I think Max is just too good to let that happen right now. But I do think they pass Ferrari. Actually, over the last 17 races, Mercedes outscored Ferrari. So it's really only the first 5 that Ferrari had them beaten. I think that continues next year. So I think they finished second. I also think they finished closer to Red Bull than Ferrari did this year.
And Stin, we've talked about this, and the whole world of Formula One talked about this. I mean, Red Bull does have some penalties with the cost cap issue last year, and obviously, given how they finished, they have less already. Do you see that level of the playing field and allowing Mercedes and Ferrari to catch back up and maybe overtake them, or do you think it's still Red Bull's to lose this year?
I think whoever wins the championship won't win by any margin of victory that happened last year. I still think that Mercedes won't win the constructors. I definitely don't think they'll win the drivers because there's too many mouths to feed. I think George won't back down and won't allow team orders to happen. We've seen it in Zandvoort, where he messed Lewis up out of getting a second or third. We've seen it a handful of times where he's just the younger kid that wants to be aggressive and doesn't want to hear no. But I think they can get second in the constructors with a handful of wins. But we'll see.
Yeah, I kind of hedge a little bit in the middle. I think I think they will win the constructors, and I think it's because I think they have the best driver pairing. I think the combination of George and Lewis is better than Max and Checo, or I think George can make up the difference there, right? And so I could see a scenario where Max wins the drivers, Lewis and or George are 2-3, and then followed by maybe Leclerc in 4. I think it would be very close. I think Mercedes is incredibly motivated to come back. I think they'll win races, and I think they'll win early. And yeah, I don't know. I think over the, Matt, you talked about the consistency of George and even Lewis towards the end of the year. I think they'll just be consistent. I don't think they'll get in their own way like we've seen Ferrari do. And I just think talent will ultimately sort of outlast throughout a 23 race season. And so I do see them bouncing back. I know that our predictions of them doing that last season were all wrong. So we could be wrong again, and I could certainly be wrong, but I truly believe it could be a 3-way battle this year for the constructors. I think it should be a good one, and I hope we get that. I hope there's a 4-way battle. I'd love to see some more variants, but I'll go Mercedes winning the constructors, but Max winning the drivers. So yeah, look, thanks for tuning in. We're going to continue to wrap up the season preview. We're only days away from the return of Formula One in Bahrain. Check out all of our other constructor previews. Again, we're going all the way from Williams all the way to Red Bull. So if you've listened to all of them up till now, you've only got 2 left. As always, thanks so much for tuning in. We appreciate your support as always. Time to get excited for the 2023 season. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.